Topics that we are going to cover today. We're going to talk about the misconception that business is always ahead and technology and IT is always lagging behind. We will talk about business is people and people are business. We'll talk about classical enterprise architecture and modern enterprise architecture and how we are going to pivot enterprise architecture radio going forward and change things a little bit. But before that, welcome to the 100th episode of Enterprise Architecture Radio. Yes, it's been 100 episodes. 100 episodes ago, I used to think that enterprise architecture, and actually I still think so, that enterprise architecture has a lot of potential in building strategy, in changing the organization, in bringing transformation. What has changed over a period of time is internalizing the concepts of enterprise architecture and completely forgetting about it. So, like Bruce Lee says, before I learned the art, a punch was just a punch and a kick was just a kick. Then I learned the art and the punch was no longer just a punch and the kick was no longer just a kick. Now that I understand the art, the punch is just a punch and a kick just a kick. Frameworks and tools enable us to do enterprise architecture, but they're not the purpose of our life. That's not what enterprise architecture do. They don't do frameworks and tools. They use frameworks and tools, but the real focus of enterprise architects is business, technology, strategy. At this point, I would like to remind you to like, subscribe, share, and comment on Enterprise Architecture Radio. If you're watching YouTube and if you're enjoying this, then don't forget to do all that. Yes, now I am one of the people who also asks for likes, subscribes, shares, and comments. It helps us in building the Enterprise Architecture Radio. Also, it helps in more and more people in taking advantage of the things that we talk about here. When we get into enterprise architecture for the first time, when we learn a framework, when we study TOGAF, etc., we assume that we talk to the business, we understand their intent, we come up with a strategy, and then we go into execution. But in the real world, that's not what really happens. You rarely get an opportunity to talk to the business, and things are a lot more chaotic in real life than you would think. I'm running a program in my organization and we are moving a large number of applications onto the public cloud. Or I would say we are moving as many applications to the public cloud as valuable. Yes, I said valuable, not possible. If I wanted to move as many applications into the public cloud as possible, it would have been a lot more easier. I would just lift and shift a bunch of applications. But we are not doing that. We're not mindlessly moving applications to AWS. We are looking at the value that each application drives in moving to the public cloud. So things such as vulnerabilities, technical debt. Is there a point in moving? Can the application be containerized? Are we going to be using native services? What are the number of incidents that are happening at this point in time, and why? And then, obviously when you set up anything anywhere for the first time, you eliminate a lot of problems that causes incidents and downtimes and so on. So there's a good amount of value in migrating and modernizing and containerizing and using native services and so on and so forth. Now, when we do this, you would assume, right, that everybody wants this, right? Everybody wants to modernize. Everybody wants to migrate. Everybody wants to eliminate tech debt and vulnerabilities and reduce incidents and so on. So it shouldn't be a problem, right? I mean, if I go and talk to the business and I say, I will move your application to the public cloud and don't worry about the cost, we'll take care of it and so on. You would assume the business would be very happy. They would say, yes, of course, modernize, migrate, remove technical debt, what have you. But that's not what really happens because there are a number of different parameters that come into play. For example, conflict of interest. Right? We work with vendor partners and the vendor partners are managing the applications for our organization. Now, if I move a certain set of applications to AWS, there is a good chance that the vendor partners might be impacted or affected, or even if their business is not affected, the people who are working on these applications, managing these applications, it's a nuisance for them. It's a whole lot of work. Also, there's the contracting. They're working on an operational contract where they're supposed to manage the application. But when we are migrating an application to AWS, there's a lot of work that is involved that they will need to do to test the application, to test the new environment, so on and so forth, which isn't included in the operational contract, right? So there is a little bit of a, they don't want to move, right? Another thing we assume is that the business is always ahead. They are bleeding edge. They are coming up with newer ways of adopting new technologies, and it's IT and technology that is lagging behind. Right? They're assuming we assume that we are incapable of adapting and being agile in meeting the business changing business requirements. But I've also seen the other way around. I know that the business wants change. I know that the business is looking to modernize and use the latest tech. But how ready are they to change themselves? I mean, they want the change, they want everything to change for them, but are they willing to accept the change in themselves? Because they will have to change the way they do business, they will have to change the way they do their work on a day to day basis. And I've come to realize that the business is not as agile as we are led to believe. In fact, I feel that technology is quite agile these days. New and new technologies are coming every other day, and we all keep talking about it. That the pace of technology is tremendous, and it's amazing. But the business is not ready to accept that change as quickly as technology is being invented. They are trying, we are trying, but it's easy to just assume that business is faster than technology. Like, for example, we are willing to give them the latest tech stack today, but they are not willing to accept it, even if we are giving it to them for free. So there are nuances to how we are giving it to them for free, and I'll not talk about that here. But business is not as agile as we think. Now, why is business not as agile as we think? The same reason we assume that technology is not as agile as we think. There is one component in this entire agility business that we completely ignore at times, and that is the people, right? We have to always remember that business really are people. They are human beings. They're people with families and with ambitions and with dreams and fears and insecurities and so on and so forth. And when there is a large and dramatic change that happens in the business, the first thing that they worry about is what's going to happen to them. How are they going to be impacted because of the change? Are they going to have a job? Are they going to have to leave their job? And so on and so forth. And many times, even though the change is feasible, they will come up with excuses and reasons to not have to change along with the changing pace of technology. And within all of this, within all these people issues and political issues, and there are times when teams have to protect their turf, because if the transformation happens and things become more agile, then people are creeping into their area of work and they don't want to transform and so on and so forth. We have to keep moving forward. We have to, within all of this, keep moving forward. So as business leaders, technology leaders, what have you, you mustn't forget that the people that we are dealing with, the business, the stakeholders, the tech leaders, they're all human beings, and they all have these people-related challenges which also need to be navigated. So we often forget that when we think about enterprise architecture, when we think about digital transformation, we rarely think about the people, And people leads to culture. When we think about the behaviors of the people as a group, as an organization, as an enterprise, that is what we talk about, organizational culture. And it becomes the responsibility of the business leaders to manage organizational behavior, to manage the culture of the enterprise. So we are going to pivot. Enterprise Architecture Radio, we're going to change a little bit. We are going to focus a little bit less on the frameworks and the tools and a little bit more on these concepts. We are going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about the business. We're going to talk about organizational changes and transformations, and of course, every once in a while we'll come back to frameworks and tools. But there are so many interesting concepts that we can talk about even within this space, right? Like business outcomes. How do you measure business outcomes? How do you design resilient organizations? How do you decode real strategy? What is strategy, and how does it align with everyday work that we are doing? And when we talk about resilient organization, it brings me to the topic of classical and modern enterprise architecture. When I started studying enterprise architecture, I started with TOGAF 8.1.1, and then 9, and then 9.1, and then 9.2, and now TOGAF 10. And it's been more than 12 years I have been working, I have been aligned with things such as enterprise architecture. I mean, I'm not an enterprise architect anymore, but this is something that interests me quite a lot because it's very close to leadership and and business, and that's what I do at this point in time. Although my title is not enterprise architecture, so all these years, since 100 episodes ago, since 12, 13 years ago, not that my podcast is that long, but since I've started associating myself with enterprise architecture and all these certifications, everything, my perspective about enterprise architecture has changed quite a bit. When we get into enterprise architecture for the first time, we are led to believe by studying all these frameworks that we have in place, whether it's Zachman, TOGAF, or which have you, that there is an dedicated enterprise architecture team that sort of reports into the CIO and that works with the CIO, ECN, leadership, etc., and understands their intent of what needs to be done, and then comes up with a strategy. And then once the strategy is defined, your current state and your future state, baseline architecture, target architecture, all of that, you hand it over to the implementation teams, and then the implementation teams go ahead and implement it, and then the enterprise architecture team performs governance, making sure that the strategy is implemented exactly how it's been defined and there are no deviations. And in case if there is a change in the strategy, then they will make sure that the implementation is done accordingly, right? That's the sort of vision that we have. But does that really happen in the real world? Not really, never. I haven't seen any enterprise architecture organization with so much teeth. There will always be corner cases where enterprise architecture team does have that much control over the organization, where nothing happens unless the enterprise architecture team has strategized for it before, but rare, right? And this is a call to action for all of you. In case if you've seen an organization where enterprise architecture does this, then please let me know, right? And what happens is, in the real world, right? First of all, enterprise architecture teams don't have so much power, even if there is a dedicated enterprise architecture team. What should happen, and that's how I define modern enterprise architecture, right? Modern enterprise architecture does not involve command and control. They are an organization that works alongside the implementation team. While classical enterprise architecture works directly with the CEO and sends things, strategy, etc., to the implementation teams to implement, and even TOGAF, for that matter, in the capability framework, defines it like that. You have the enterprise architecture organization, which is called design, reporting into the CIO. And then you've got the implementation organization, where you have PMO and such. And then you have deployment organization or operations organization, which are all of them reporting into the CIO. So that is the amount of power that enterprise architecture teams wield. But in real life, that doesn't happen. So my concept of modern enterprise architecture is that the enterprise architecture team primary job is to catalog and enable, right? Catalog meaning you record information about all the applications and business and data and technology and so on and so forth into an enterprise architecture repository so that it can give a bigger picture view about what's happening, right? And then you have your implementation teams working on various projects, so you work with them, and as they build their programs and projects and implement their programs and projects based on the strategy, of course, right? Leadership has a certain strategy that, okay, we have to, let's say, cut costs on, on-premise data centers, the management of on-premise data centers. We are going to exit a bunch of data centers. We need to move to cloud or what have you, right? And then a program is created and a certain amount of investment is made. And then, the enterprise architecture team works with these programs, documenting and cataloging all the information that is generated out of these programs, right? How many applications, how many servers, how much data, what is the life cycle of the hardware, how are we moving to cloud, what is the value, what is the carbon footprint, and so on and so forth. And then they enable these programs with a bigger picture view, right? And it is quintessential. It's very, very valuable. Many times we don't realize the importance of a bigger picture view. You're running a program in your silo. You don't have any idea what's happening in the rest of the organization. The enterprise architects do, because that's what they do. They catalog information and they have a bigger picture view. Now, what does it really mean by a bigger picture view? And it means, reusable components. Now, we talk about reusable components, and it's a very, very theoretical concept. What is a reusable component, right? A design pattern could be a reusable component, and that's the theoretical answer, really. Design pattern being reusable component. An application being used somewhere else can be reused, but these are all very, very theoretical. In the real world, reusable components could be very unique, like a relationship, for example, right? Let's say that there is a program that is doing these cloud migrations that we talked about earlier, right? They are basically looking at all the applications in the organizational landscape, and they're trying to move applications to public cloud so that they can clear out a few data centers or reduce the hardware costs or what have you. And then there is another team that is doing infrastructure automation, or infrastructure as a code, so to speak. They've got pipelines, Terraform, Ansible, Jenkins, what have you, and provisioning of infrastructure. They're trying to automate that as much as possible. So these are two teams, right? Now, let us say that it so happens that quite a few pipelines within the automation team that have been created are failing. And that is causing a tremendous amount of issues with the turnaround time, right? The provisioning takes time. Sometimes the pipelines fail. So, you've got to roll back the whatever has already been provisioned and start all over again. And this time you might have to do it manually. And so there's a quality issue. And the program team that is migrating applications to AWS is, their performance is impacted. Their turnaround times are impacted because of this. Now they're struggling with all of this. Now, the third thing, also happens that the partner organization that this program team is using to migrate applications is the same partner organization that the automation team is using to create those automation pipelines, right? Now, an enterprise architect who has a bigger picture view of all of this knows that relationship with that partner organization is a reusable component, right? What that means is we can leverage that relationship to improve the quality of the automation pipelines, and in effect improving the performance of the program organization. So in real life, an enterprise architecture organization has a much bigger picture view, and they enable various programs teams to do their job better, to improve their performance, turnaround times, to make things easier and smoother. And anyway, classical enterprise architecture cannot function anymore in the modern context, because if you look at the flexibility and agility that is required these days in organizations is too much. You look at inorganic growth of organizations these days, right? Mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, spin-offs. There are a large number of mergers and acquisitions happening year on year within organizations. If you look at the data of the number of mergers and acquisitions happening year on year, or the amount of money that is being invested into mergers and acquisitions year on year, it is growing at an incremental pace, right? And sometimes an organization has to go through 2 or 3 mergers and acquisitions, or multiple mergers and acquisition events within a single year. So the life cycle of the merger and acquisition, like for example, an organization has acquired another organization, the amount of time that it has to complete the acquisition, and when I say complete the acquisition, I mean not just the contract, but integrating systems, integrating people, integrating organization structures, and so on and so forth, building processes that intertwine with each other, because the other organization is now going to become one business function within this enterprise, and so on. So that integration, the amount of time that an organization has to integrate both the organizations, right, is small, 3 to 6 months sometimes. And sometimes we have multiple mergers and acquisition events happening and integrations happening in parallel. So imagine the amount of complexity that is required, and there is an investment to this. The amount of money that is spent on the merger, you can't spend a lot of money in implementing that merger or in integrating the organization, right? Or whether it's a merger or acquisition or divestiture or what have you. So the life cycle time of each merger event has reduced drastically. Now, in such a situation, if there's an enterprise architecture organization that constantly talks about, governance and control, and it's not possible. It's not practical. The enterprise architecture organization has to work with the various program teams and enable them, give them the bigger picture view, and so on and so forth. In the modern context, enterprise architecture is no longer a command and control organization. It is a enterprise architecture as a service model with customer satisfaction surveys at the end of every program and everything, right? The mindset needs to change. So that's the pivot. We are going forward. We are going to talk less about enterprise architecture frameworks and tools and more about organizational strategy, leadership, technology, etc., etc. We'll talk about some of the nuances of challenges at work. And there's one listener of Enterprise Architecture Radio who has requested that I also cover a series of episodes in which I talk about guidance to new enterprise architects. And it's an interesting concept, although I'm not entirely sure what I'm really going to talk about. Probably I will talk about things that they should think about and how they can expand their scope and impact as an enterprise architect. And that should be interesting. So I'll work on it very soon. That should be interesting. But there also, I will not be talking about frameworks and tools. That's something that you can learn from a training organization. And I have talked about it in tremendous amount of detail in the last 100 episodes. Like I talked about in my previous episode, I will also start inviting guests to Enterprise Architecture Radio. Not every episode will be a guest episode because it's very difficult to schedule guests. I wanted to start the guest thing on the 100th episode, but turns out that, and I don't have enough interviews recorded yet. I would like to have at least 8 to 10 interviews recorded with guests to actually start publishing them. So I said, okay, let's take it easy. I'll do a 100th episode right now and then, we'll start with the guests eventually. So if you're a business leader or a technology leader, and if you'd like to come to Enterprise Architecture Radio as a guest, then feel free to reach out. I'm on the Telegram group. We can talk about it and let's plan something. I'm adding a new section to the Enterprise Architecture Radio now on. In this section, I will cover a book, a podcast, or a trend that I'm following, and I will talk about that a little bit. So at this point in time, I'm reading a book called Algorithms to Live By. And this is a book by Brian Christian and Tom Griffith. And this book basically takes the computer science principles and algorithms and how and optimizes it and talks about how we can use these algorithms in life. Like there's a 37% rule algorithm for choosing the right life partner, for example, or choosing the right secretary is the example that it takes. And then there are searching and sorting algorithms that are usually used in computer science that can be effectively used in life to declutter your life or to prioritize your tasks on a day-to-day basis and so on. So it's a very interesting read. I would recommend the book called Algorithms to Live by Tom Griffith and Brian Christian. That's all I have today on this 100th episode. Once again, I would like to remind you to like, subscribe, share, and comment. If you're enjoying the podcast, don't forget to do that. It helps the podcast. Enterprise Architecture Radio continues to be not just a podcast, but also a collaboration platform, a place where people come together and talk about their challenges, about their, organizational transformations, digital transformations, learn from each other, guide each other, but most importantly, have a ton of fun.